Continuing on with the appendicular skeleton, let's take a look at the lower extremities. Looking at the pelvic girdle and the hip bones, the pelvic girdle equals two hip bones, that's these, united at the pubic symphysis, and it's going to articulate posteriorly with the sacrum, here's the sacrum, at the sacroiliac joints. Here's the sacroiliac joints. Now there is another name for these hip bones. A better name is what we call the os coxa, or coxal bones. Okay, so there are two os coxa. And again, os means bone. So coxal bone is the same as os coxa. And then each hip bone consists of the ilium. So this is the ilium. The pubis. Okay, the pubis. And the ischium. And they're going to fuse together to form this little dished out cup called the acetabulum. Acetabulum. Now, does anybody know what acetic acid is? Acetic acid. I might have mentioned that in another lecture, but acetic acid is vinegar. Now, in the old days, back when they first started naming these bones and everything, this reminded the early anatomists of a bowl that you would keep vinegar in. Okay, and so what does that have to do with anything? Well, they named these back in the 1600s. There was no refrigeration. How did you keep like meat and things like that from spoiling? Well, it's kind of hard to do. Usually meat would be hanging. You would scrape the mold off of it, slice the meat. Oftentimes it was rancid. The fats turned bad. And in order to cover up that taste, everyone would have a little bowl of vinegar in front of them to dip the meat in, which would explain why teeth were probably not in that good a shape at the time. That's just going to eat away the enamel, basically, on the teeth. But anyway, I don't know what's worse, the rancid meat taste or the rancid meat taste trying to be covered up by vinegar. It'd be awful. But anyway, acetic acid is the main component of vinegar. Acetabulum means vinegar bowl. Okay. And this is where the head of the femur will fit. So again, the pelvic girdle is the two hip bones, or os coxa. And again, it's going to be connected by the pubic symphysis. And the bony pelvis, we're just going to add a little bit more to it, where we have the two hip bones, the two os coxa, the sacrum, and the coccyx, or your tailbone. Okay, so this is the bony pelvis. Okay. Okay, looking here, this is the ischium, and this is the pubis, or your pubic bone. Now, hopefully everybody by now knows that your pubic bone is in the front. Okay. Now, the ischium has this lumpy thing on it here called the ischial tuberosity. That's what you're sitting on. If you're sitting in a chair right now, that's what you're sitting on, is this ischial tuberosity. That's your bony butt bone. If you've ever had like a little kid sit in your lap, a little skinny kid, and they're squirming around, and their bony butt bone is digging into your leg, and then you're like, hey kid, I don't have any kids. What are you doing sitting in my lap? Go find your own parents. Okay, but that's just me. This is the ischial tuberosity is what you're feeling there. Okay, that's your bony butt bone. Okay. So going back to the ischium and the pubis, you're going to want to tell which is which. Okay, you want to know anterior from posterior. Otherwise, there's a whole lot you'll get wrong on an exam. So one way to tell the anterior from posterior is in the posterior view, you have this large notch and this smaller notch. This large knot is the greater sciatic notch. The smaller notch, which we find on the ischium, is the lesser sciatic notch. And this is what's going to tell you that this is posterior. If this is posterior and you sit on your posterior, right? You know, your butt's in the posterior region, then you know that this is the ischium and this is the ischial tuberosity. The other thing is we've got the ischial spine right here. So this pointy thing, this is what kind of separates the greater sciatic notch, which is part of the ilium, and the lesser sciatic notch, which is part of the ischium. And then we also have a ramus, and ramus means a branch. And so here you can see it branching. So this is going to be the ischial ramus. Now the pubis, the pubic bone, we're going to have the body, which is the main portion, and then there's going to be a superior and inferior ramus. It's that inferior ramus that's going to hook up with the ramus of the ischium. And we're also going to have a fibrocartilaginous pad, which is the pubic symphysis. Let's go back here. Right here's the pubic symphysis, and this is what connects each of your two pubic bones. Okay. Now together, they're going to form this hole. This hole is called the obturator foramen. Obturator foramen. Looking at the ilium, we have the iliac crest, so that's the top of that hip bone. And we also have some iliac spines. Now this is where you really have to know the anterior from the posterior. Again, this greater sciatic notch, which is part of the ilium, is posterior. We're looking at this from a side view. Okay, so this is a side view. So this is anterior, this is posterior. This is the lateral view because here's the acetabulum where the head of the femur fits in. This would be a medial view. Okay. So back to these iliac spines. Think about, and you might have bumped these before. They're right in the front, you know, just around your belt region. On each side, you have some bones that stick out on each side. That's going to be your anterior superior iliac spine. So that's your ASIS, your anterior superior iliac spine. Now, once you have that memorized, the rest you can just kind of extrapolate. So if you have an anterior superior iliac spine, you must have a what? An anterior inferior iliac spine. All right, so going back to this, if you have an anterior superior iliac spine, you must have a, what's the opposite of anterior? Posterior superior iliac spine. And if you have a posterior superior iliac spine, you must have a posterior inferior iliac spine. So this is your ASIS, your AIIS, your PSIS, and your PIIS. Okay, anterior superior iliac spine, anterior inferior iliac spine, posterior superior iliac spine, posterior inferior iliac spine. Okay. All right, and then we also have what's called the iliac fossa. Now looking at the medial portion here, here is the iliac fossa. Now some muscles attached there, and the cup that forms is where intestines sit. And then on the outermost region, the lateral region, we have gluteal lines, and these are for your gluteal muscles. So here's the anterior gluteal line. And then the sacroiliac joint, you're going to see, and again, this looks like an ear, doesn't it? Here's an earlobe. Looks like an ear. Another term for ear is auricle. So this is the auricular, there it is, auricular surface. And this is going to hook up with the auricular surface of the sacrum, and that's what gives us our sacroiliac joint. Okay. And then again, the greater sciatic notch, and what that's for is the sciatic nerve passes through there on its way down to the back of your leg. Now looking at the pelvis, we have this rim right here. Okay, so we have this rim. It's called the pelvic brim. Goes from the sacral promontory all the way around to the pubic symphysis. And it's going to separate the false pelvis from the true pelvis. So anything above that brim is going to be the false pelvis. That holds abdominal organs, mainly intestines. Anything below that rim, down in here, okay, if we cut it in half and look at it, down in here is going to be the true pelvis. Okay, the true pelvis, you're going to have the bladder, you're going to have reproductive organs, such as the uterus, is down in the true pelvis. Okay, and if we draw a line from the sacral promontory to the top of the pubic symphysis, that is going to be your pelvic inlet, basically. And from the tip of the coccyx to the bottom of the pubic symphysis, that's going to be the pelvic outlet. Okay, and so we're also going to create this pelvic axis here, and that's the path that the baby's head will follow during a natural delivery. All right, so looking at the male and female skeleton. Now, the skeleton itself, not just the pelvis here, but the skeleton itself, the male skeleton, tends to be on average larger and heavier, and it's going to have larger articular surfaces and larger muscle attachments. The female pelvis, however, differs from the male pelvis in that the male pelvis is much more narrow, okay, and the female pelvis is going to be much more wider and also more shallow. It's going to have a larger pelvic inlet and outlet, and there's going to be a lot more space down in the true pelvis. Obviously, if the uterus is down in this true pelvis, it's going to need that room, as a baby develops. And then the pubic arch is going to be greater than 90 degrees in the female skeleton. It typically rounds out a lot more. The male's pubic arch tends to be a lot sharper and narrower. So that's one way you can tell a male pelvis from a female pelvis. From the side view, you can see again, female pelvis is much wider, male's is much narrower. A lot more room in the pelvic outlet and inlet. Male's tends to be a little bit smaller, almost heart-shaped if you kind of trace it out. Now each lower limb contains 30 bones. We have the femur and the patella within the thigh. And within the leg, we have the tibia and the fibula. Now, don't get confused because, again, when we see this, we say, oh, that's a leg. But in anatomy, this is the thigh, this is the leg. Okay? Now, when we get down into the foot, remember in the hand we had carpals? Here's how I kind of remember this. Instead of fingers in the foot, what do we have? Toes, which start with a T. So I think instead of carpals, we have tarsals. Okay, so we have tarsals. And those are kind of the ankle bones and such. Then we have the metatarsals. And those are, of course, are like the metacarpals. And then we have the phalanges, which are like what? Well, they're like the phalanges. Okay. And remember I said the way we count fingers, you know, those phalanges, is we start off with the thumb, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and the little finger is 5. Well, in the foot, we start off with the big toe. The big toe is 1. And then 2, 3, 4, 5 is the little toe. Okay. Now, the joints, we have the hip joint. We have the knee joint. We have the ankle joint. And then we have the proximal and distal tibiofibular joint. So here's the proximal tibiofibular joint. And here's the distal tibiofibular joint. And remember, I said if you made a fist, your knuckles were going to be the metacarpal phalangeal joints. Well, if you could make a fist with your toes, and I don't recommend you do that. I've taken a lot of martial arts, and if you make a fist with your toes and try to punch somebody, there will be lots of damage. You'll hear cracking, and it won't be the person you just punched with your toe knuckles. It will be you. You'll be laying on the ground, rolling around in pain. So I don't recommend anybody punch anybody with toe knuckles. Anyway, if you could, though, that would be your metatarsal phalangeal joints. So metatarsal phalangeal joints. And, of course, you have your dips and your pips in the phalanges. Again, distal interphalangeal joints and proximal interphalangeal joints. Okay, so the femur or thigh bone is going to be the longest and strongest bone in the body. The head of the femur articulates with the acetabulum, again that cup in the pelvic bone here, and it's going to be attached by the ligament of the head of the femur. Now, if you look at a femoral head, there's going to be a little divot there, and we call that the fovea of the head of the femur. And it's that fovea where you're going to have that attachment of the ligament. Then we have the neck, and the neck is the structure most likely to fracture. It's the most common fracture site in the hip. Because think about it, you've got the entire weight of the body coming down and putting all of its force into this little area here. And so hip fractures, very common, especially in the elderly, and even more common in elderly females, which tend to have a higher degree of osteoporosis. And a lot of times you might think, you know, grandma fell and broke her hip, but what could happen is you can have so much osteoporosis in this bone here that finally just the weight of the body shears the hip, and then grandma falls. So not a good thing. So extremely painful, and yeah, it's not too great, especially for seniors. This can be replaced, of course, you know, with an arthroplasty. Arthro means joint, plasty means repair of. and so they can do a hip repair, and a hip replacement. And I'm not even going to go into that too much because there's so many different materials that they use now. One of the older ones, of course, is it's a metal shaft that kind of gets hammered. This gets sawn off. It has a shaft that gets glued and hammered into place, and then it has kind of a metal ball on the end, and then you place a plastic cup on the inside of the hip. Of course, there's a lot of changes that take place because some of the metals people react to, some of the plastics wear out and break down, so there's always new innovations. And so other things, we have greater and lesser trochanter. The greater trochanter is out here. So there's the greater trochanter. And then we have a lesser trochanter, which is here. And then on the back of the femur, we have what's called the linea aspera. Doesn't show it on here, but it's a kind of a raised line or ridge going down the center of the back of the femur. So it's the linea aspera. Also on the back, you'll see a roughened area toward the top, and that's called the gluteal tuberosity. And those are all for muscle attachments. If we go down to the bottom, we're going to have these condyles. Again, you can see those better from a posterior view. So you'll have the medial condyle and the lateral condyle. And of course, above the condyles, we have the lateral epicondyle and medial epicondyle. Now, if you're trying to figure out the difference between the medial and lateral epicondyle, you have to take a look up here at the head of the femur. Head of the femur, of course, has to angle in medially, right? If it's angling out laterally, you need an orthopedic surgeon. So it's angling in medially. So this is the medial side of the bone. So if we go down, here's the medial epicondyle. Here's the medial condyle. This then would be the lateral aspect of the femur. So this is your lateral epicondyle and your lateral condyle. And if this patella here were out of the way, we'd notice a nice smooth patellar surface that this rides on. And so looking at the patella, it's going to be a triangular bone. And we say that it is a sesamoid bone. Now, sesamoid means seed. And doesn't it look like those seeds like on a hamburger bun? Those 2 all beef patty, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesamoid seed bun. Okay, not sesamoid, but sesame. So actually, when you think about it, sesame seed really means seed. Kind of redundant. But anyway, this is a seed-shaped bone or sesamoid bone. Okay. It's going to have a base. The apex points downward. And what it's going to do is increase leverage of the quadriceps femoris tendon. So basically your quads merge down onto the patella, and then they kind of leave the patella and create what's called the patellar tendon that attaches here to your tibial tuberosity. And again, that just increases leverage, acts as kind of a fulcrum at that point for the knee. Now, if you ever have a patella and wonder if it's a right or a left, what you do is you take the patella, you have the part that goes against the femur, and you have that facing downward, down toward the table. You take this apex and you point it away from you. Okay, so point the apex away from you, set it on the table, and see which way it falls. If it falls to the right, it's a right patella. If it falls to the left, it's a left patella. Okay, looking at the tibia and the fibula. Now notice the tibia does not have an L in it. A lot of people like to call it the tibula and fibula. That's not correct. We have the tibia and fibula. Now the tibia is going to be your medial and larger leg bone. It's going to be a weight-bearing bone. If you notice, it comes straight down right on top of these tarsals. Okay, the main tarsal is going to be the talus. And it's going to have a lateral and medial condyles, and those are going to be up here. They're going to articulate with the lateral and medial condyles of the femur. But right here would be the lateral condyle and the medial condyle of the tibia. On X-ray, it looks very flat, and we call these the tibial plateaus. And so we have this lump right underneath your knee, and you could feel that on yourself, this lump here. This is called the tibial tuberosity, and again, that's for attachment of the patellar ligament. Then we have the proximal tibiofibular joint, right up here. And if we follow this down, you know those two lumps down by your foot that we call ankles? You know, that's my ankle bone. Well, those are actually two different bones. The one medial, which we call the medial malleolus, is part of the tibia. The lateral bump is called the lateral malleolus, and that's part of the fibula. Now, looking at the fibula, it's not part of the knee joint. It's for muscle attachment only. It's more of a stabilizing or splinting type of a joint. But we do, again, have the head of the fibula up here, and the lateral malleolus is toward the bottom. Looking next, we have the tarsal bones, or the tarsus. Now, the proximal region of the foot contains 7 tarsal bones. The talus equals your ankle bone, which articulates with the tibia and the fibula. The calcaneus is your heel bone. And then we have the cuboid, which is kind of a cube-shaped bone. The navicular sounds like what? Sounds like the Navy, right? And what is the Navy like? They like their boats. See how this is boat-shaped? Okay, so navicular. And then we have these 3 wedged-shaped bones called cuneiforms. I don't know if you've ever seen cuneiform writing, but it's where they take some clay, and then they'll take, it's an aquatic plant, I want to say a sedge, and they clip the sedge, and the sedge plant, it's a water plant. It has 3 corners to it, and they compress that into the clay to write. Okay, so that's early cuneiform writing. Cuneiform, again, is kind of triangular in shape. And so when we put 3 triangular things together, okay, what's it going to form? It's going to form an arch. So the shape of these cuneiforms helps to form the arch of the foot. And so pull out a piece of paper and a pen, and in the next little video clip, I'm going to show you how to memorize the tarsals. This is a memory tip for learning the tarsals in the foot. And I'm your host, Dr. Jerry McNally. First, I'd like you to make a square. Split that square in half, split the bottom in half, split the left in half, and then cut the bottom part into 2 pieces, and then draw another square in the top section. This will be the medial side of the foot. This will be the lateral side of the foot. Then put in a T, a C, an N, an M, an I, an L, and another C. And so your mnemonic is going to be tiger cubs need milk. And we're going to use a C instead of a K. And this means talus, calcaneus, navicular, medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiforms. And the C is for the cuboid. I hope this helps. Today's tip is brought to you by the Academy of Anatomy. And I'm Dr. Jerry McNally. Thanks for watching. Well, I hope that video clip helped. And so, moving along, after the tarsals, we get into the metatarsals, and that's in the mid-region of the foot. There's going to be 5 metatarsals, and number 1 is the most medial. So again, that's the one that's going to attach to the big toe. Remember I said big toe is number 1. Okay, and so again, just like the metacarpals, it's going to have a head, which is the rounded area. It's going to have a shaft, and it's going to have a base. Okay. And again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Little toe area is going to be 5. Now, one thing that the 5th metatarsal has, and it's going to be right by the cuboid, and you can even feel this on your own foot. If you place your finger along the edge of, like the calcaneus, and again, this is running along the edge of the foot, you come up to kind of this bump right here, and that's the styloid of the 5th metatarsal. And then you know you're at the end of the metatarsal, and then this bone right here is going to be the cuboid. Okay. And so going down to the phalanges, which is the distal portion of the foot, it's similar to the number of arrangements in the hand. Again, with the big toe being 1, little toe 5. And it's going to also have a proximal, middle, and distal, or in the case of the big toe, just a proximal and distal phalanx. And again, it's going to have the same type of joints with the proximal interphalangeal joint, your pip, and the distal interphalangeal joint, your dip. And just like the hand, the thumb has its own name, which is pollex. Well, in this case, the big toe has its own name, and it's called hallux. And then looking at the arches of the foot, the function of the arches is to distribute body weight over the foot. It's going to yield and spring back when the foot is lifted. And we actually have 3 arches in the foot. We have the longitudinal arches, which are on each side of the foot, and as you can see, we have a medial and lateral longitudinal arch. So medial, lateral longitudinal arch. And then going over across the top of the foot, we have the transverse arch. And that's going to include the navicular, the cuneiforms, and the base of the metatarsals. And remember, I talked about how the cuneiforms are wedge-shaped. You put those together, and again, that's going to create that arch in the foot.